My name is Emma Brooks. I'm 36 years old, and until one quiet Tuesday morning, I believed I had done the one thing that mattered most in my life, absolutely right. Because for 18 years, every decision I made revolved around a single promise I whispered to myself the night my daughter Lily was born. A promise that no matter how hard my life became, no matter how tired or lonely or stretched thin I felt, her future would be protected. And that promise had a number attached to it. A very real number that lived in my mind like a finish line I was slowly crawling toward. $214,000. The college fund I built dollar by dollar for my daughter. Not inherited money, not help from anyone else, but money earned through night shifts, double shifts, missed holidays, and the quiet discipline of saying no to myself so I could say yes to her someday. And I never imagined that the person who would destroy that promise would be my own mother. The morning it happened started like any other workday. My alarm went off at 5:30. I moved quietly through my small kitchen so I would not wake Lily, who was 18 now and sleeping late because it was summer before her senior year. And as the coffee brewed, I opened my banking app the way I did every few days out of habit, not because I planned to touch the money. Never that. But because checking on it reassured me, because seeing that number grow had become proof that my sacrifices meant something. And for a split second, my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing, because where there should have been a balance, there was nothing. A clean zero staring back at me like an accusation. And I remember blinking, then closing the app and reopening it, then checking the account number again as if the app had made some mistake. But the mistake was not the app. The mistake was my trust. Because right there, under recent activity, was a single transaction, an in-person withdrawal. Authorized user. Amount $214,000. And the name attached to it was my mother's, Margaret Brooks. I felt something drop through my body. Not panic at first, but a hollowing sensation, as if gravity had suddenly shifted and everything inside me slid out of place. And I sat down hard at the kitchen table, gripping my phone with both hands, trying to breathe, because this was not just money. This was Lily's future. This was tuition, housing, books, security, options. The difference between starting adult life with hope instead of debt. And my mother had taken all of it in one movement, like erasing a chalkboard. And the strangest part was that my first thought was not anger, but disbelief. Because who does that? Who looks at their granddaughter's education fund and decides it belongs to them? I did not call first. I drove, my hands shaking on the steering wheel as I replayed every conversation I had ever had with my mother about that account. Every time she had said she was just helping me keep it safe. Every time she had reminded me how lucky I was to have her looking out for us. And by the time I pulled into her driveway, my disbelief had hardened into something colder, sharper, because deep down, a part of me already knew this was not an accident. She opened the door before I knocked, as if she had been expecting me, and there she was, 62 years old, perfectly composed, wearing a pressed blouse and that familiar expression of calm authority she always used when she believed she was in control. And I remember how strange it felt that the world outside her house looked normal. Birds in the yard, a neighbor watering flowers, while my life was unraveling inside my chest. I did not raise my voice, I did not cry, because something inside me went very still. And I asked the question that had been burning a hole through me since dawn. Where is Lily's college fund? And my mother did not flinch. She did not even pretend to be confused. She smiled, not a nervous smile, not a guilty one, but a relaxed, almost amused smile. And then she laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and said, "Emma, relax. I used it for something important." And that laugh was the moment the story crossed a line from painful to unforgivable. Because anyone can justify theft to themselves, but laughing while you do it is something else entirely." I asked her what she meant, my voice low and tight, and she waved a hand as if brushing away something trivial and said, "You were not using it yet, and Rachel needed help now." And then she said the sentence that still echoes in my head at night. She said, "Think of it as you helping your sister. You have always been good at sacrificing." And the casual cruelty of that statement took my breath away. Because she was not just admitting what she had done, she was framing it as a virtue, as if stealing from my child was simply another expectation I should accept quietly, the way I always had. I told her that money was for Lily, that it was not mine to give, that it had a purpose, and she shrugged, actually shrugged, and said, "Lily will figure something out. Kids always do." And that was when I realized this was never about money to her. It was about power, about deciding whose needs mattered and whose could be postponed indefinitely. I walked out before I said something I could not take back, my chest burning, my hands numb. And as I sat in my car trying to steady myself, my phone rang, and it was my father, Daniel Brooks, 65 years old, a man who had spent his entire life avoiding conflict. And when I answered, all I heard was his breathing at first, uneven and shaky. And then his voice broke as he said, "Emma, I did not know she was really going to do it." And that was when the story cracked open even further. Because this was not just my mother acting alone. This was a family system that had allowed her to believe she could do this without consequence. My father told me she had said she was reallocating some family funds, that she had made it sound temporary, harmless, necessary. And he admitted he had not asked enough questions, because he never did. And as he apologized through tears, I stared at my steering wheel and felt a truth settle into my bones. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not desperation. This was premeditated. And my daughter was collateral damage in a plan my mother believed she was entitled to execute. I thought about Lily asleep in her room, about the college brochures spread across her desk, about the way her face lit up when she talked about studying environmental science, about how proud I had been when I realized I could actually give her choices, and the thought of looking her in the eye and telling her that her grandmother had decided those dreams were less important than her own priorities made my stomach twist. I had always known my family was complicated, that my mother had strong opinions, and my father avoided standing up to her, that my younger sister Rachel had been rescued more times than I could count, while I was praised for being independent. But until that moment, I had never named it for what it was. A toxic family dynamic, built on my silence and my willingness to absorb harm quietly. And my mother had mistaken that silence for permission. As I sat there, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to my father apologize for not protecting me, something shifted inside me. Because for the first time, my instinct was not to smooth things over, not to minimize what had happened for the sake of peace, but to draw a line. And I realized with terrifying clarity that this was no longer about me being a good daughter. It was about me being a good mother. And those two roles had just collided head-on. My mother believed I would eventually calm down, that I would complain and then accept it the way I always had, because family was family, and money came and went. And she had no idea that by touching my daughter's future, she had crossed a boundary I would never allow anyone to cross again, not even her. I started the car and drove away from her house, knowing that whatever came next would change everything, because I was done being the reliable one who cleaned up everyone else's mess, done being the sacrifice that made the system work. And as the morning sun climbed higher and the world continued as if nothing had happened, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was going to protect my child, even if it meant standing against my own mother. Even if it meant tearing apart the illusion of family harmony she valued more than honesty. because the truth was simple and brutal. My mother had stolen $214,000 from my daughter's college fund. She had laughed when confronted, and I was about to make sure that this was not something she could ever laugh about again. When I say that money represented 18 years of my life, I do not mean it metaphorically. I mean it in the most literal sense, because Lily was born when I was just 18 years old, scared, exhausted, and already aware that the world was not built to be kind to young single mothers. And the night I held her in my arms in that cramped hospital room, listening to the steady beep of the monitor and the soft sounds of nurses moving in the hallway, I understood something with painful clarity. No one was coming to save us. And if my daughter was going to have a future that was not shaped by my mistakes or my circumstances, it would be because I built it with my own hands. I went back to work 6 weeks after giving birth, my body still sore, my emotions raw, because rent did not pause for postpartum recovery, and diapers did not pay for themselves. And I remember leaving Lily with my mother for the first time, standing in the doorway longer than necessary, memorizing the way her chest rose and fell as she slept, wondering if choosing work over staying home made me a bad mother, and promising myself that every hour I was away from her would serve a purpose. I worked nights at the hospital, long 12-hour shifts where my feet throbbed and my back ached, and the fluorescent lights made time feel endless. And during the day, when Lily was small, I picked up extra hours wherever I could, sometimes cleaning offices, sometimes covering shifts other people did not want. And every paycheck followed the same ritual. Bills first, groceries next, and then whatever was left, even if it was only $20, went straight into the account labeled Lily College Fund. I did not buy new clothes unless the old ones were beyond repair. I drove the same aging car year after year, ignoring the rattle that started somewhere around Lily's 10th birthday. And vacations were something other families talked about, not something we did. Because my idea of rest became sitting at the kitchen table late at night with a cup of cheap coffee, balancing numbers, and feeling a small sense of relief when I saw that the account had grown again. My mother used to comment on my discipline, half admiring, half amused, telling friends that I was always so serious, so responsible, as if those qualities had appeared out of nowhere instead of being forged by necessity. And when people asked how I managed on my own, she would smile and say, "Emma has always been strong. She does not need much help." And I would nod along, because it was easier than explaining that strength is often just what happens when you do not have the option to fall apart. Lily grew up understanding sacrifice in quiet ways, not through lectures, but through observation. She knew that if I said no to something, there was a reason. She learned early that we packed lunches instead of buying them, that thrift stores were not a source of shame, but of practicality. And she never complained, not once. And that made me more determined to give her choices later. Choices I never had. When she turned 13 and started talking about college in vague, hopeful terms, I showed her the account for the first time. Not the exact balance, but the concept, explaining that every deposit represented time and effort, that education was something we were building together. And the look on her face, a mixture of surprise and pride and disbelief, stayed with me. Because in that moment, I saw how much security mattered to a child, how knowing someone was planning for your future changed the way you saw yourself. I worked my way up at the hospital, eventually becoming a head nurse. Not because I loved management, but because the pay was better and the benefits mattered. And every promotion felt less like a personal achievement and more like another layer of armor for Lily. Another guarantee that she would not have to start her adult life already behind. My mother often reminded me that I could relax more, that life was not only about saving and planning, that Rachel needed help now and then, that family meant sharing. And I listened politely, always assuming she meant well, always believing that as long as the account was untouched, as long as the number continued to grow, everything else was manageable. Looking back, I can see how my reliability became a tool, how my willingness to sacrifice made it easier for others to take. Because when you are the one who always figures things out, people start to assume you always will, no matter what they do. By the time Lily turned 18, the account had reached $214,000, a number that represented 18 years of saying no, 18 years of working when I was tired, 18 years of choosing responsibility over comfort. And I remember sitting alone in my car after work one evening, looking at that balance and crying quietly. Not because I was sad, but because I was proud, because I had kept my promise. And in that moment, I believed that no one could take that away from us. Not legally, not morally, not even my own family. And that belief, that sense of earned security, was the thing my mother destroyed when she emptied the account without hesitation, without permission, and without remorse, turning 18 years of discipline and love into a resource she felt entitled to redistribute. The truth that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it is that my mother did not break into anything or forge a single signature. She did not need to, because the door had been opened for her years earlier, back when I was 19, overwhelmed and desperate to believe that at least one adult in my life was firmly on my side. And that is how the joint account was born. Not out of greed or carelessness, but out of fear and trust, mixed together in a way that now feels painfully naive. Lily was only a few months old when my mother first brought it up, sitting across from me at her kitchen table, her voice calm and reassuring, telling me that young mothers needed safeguards, that accidents happened, that if something ever happened to me, the money I was saving for Lily could get tied up in court or mismanaged by people who did not care about her. And she said it would be smarter to put her name on the account as well, just as a precaution, just so she could step in and protect Lily if I ever could not. I remember hesitating, not because I distrusted her, but because the idea of anyone else having access to that money made me uncomfortable. And she noticed that hesitation immediately, leaning forward, touching my hand and saying, "Emma, I am your mother. I would never take anything from you or from my granddaughter. I just want to make sure she is safe." And at 19, exhausted and terrified of making the wrong choice, that sounded reasonable, even loving. And I agreed. We went to the bank together. She handled the paperwork with the confidence of someone who had done it many times before, chatting with the teller by first name, explaining that we were setting up a savings account for her granddaughter's education. And I remember feeling grateful that someone older and more experienced was guiding me through something that felt intimidating. For years after that, the account functioned exactly as intended, at least on the surface. I deposited money, the balance grew, and my mother never touched it. Not once. And that consistency reinforced my belief that I had made the right decision, that my trust had been well placed. Whenever I mentioned the account, she would nod approvingly, telling me I was doing the right thing, telling other people how proud she was of my discipline. And over time, the presence of her name on that account faded into the background of my life, something theoretical rather than real, a safety net I never expected to need. What I did not understand then was that control does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waits patiently, embedded in legal structures and unspoken assumptions, until the moment it becomes useful. And my mother understood money in a way I did not as a neutral resource, but as leverage. Growing up, she often talked about how hard her childhood had been, how scarce everything was, how she had learned early that money equaled security, and security equaled power. And while I believed that shaped her caution, I did not realize it had also shaped her need to decide who deserved help and who needed to learn lessons. She liked being the one people came to when they were in trouble, liked being the gatekeeper, and by putting her name on that account, I had unknowingly handed her the ultimate gatekeeping tool over my life and my daughter's future. Over the years, there were small moments that I dismissed at the time, but now stand out with painful clarity. Comments about how the money was just sitting there. Remarks about how family resources should be shared. Questions about whether Lily really needed to go to an expensive school when community colleges existed. All framed as practical concerns, all easy to brush off because the account itself remained untouched. My mother never pressured me directly to use that money for anything else, and that restraint made her eventual betrayal even more shocking, because it meant she had been capable of patience, capable of waiting until the moment suited her needs. The structure of a joint account is deceptively simple. 2 names, equal access, and when I signed those papers, I thought equal access meant equal responsibility, that it implied a shared understanding of purpose. But legally, it meant something very different. It meant that either of us could withdraw every dollar without consulting the other, and the bank would consider it a legitimate transaction. That legal reality sat dormant for nearly 2 decades, while I operated under a moral understanding that my mother had helped create. The understanding that the money was not really ours, that it belonged to Lily's future. And it never occurred to me that my mother did not share that understanding. Not fully. When she finally acted, she did so with the confidence of someone who knew the system was on her side. Walking into the branch she had frequented for years, presenting her identification, signing her name, and walking out with $214,000 that did not belong to her in any moral sense, but belonged to her legally, at least on paper. That is the part that still unsettles me the most. Not just that she took the money, but that she did it openly, without secrecy, because in her mind, she had already justified it. She had already decided that her priorities outweighed my intentions, that her authority as a mother trumped my role as a parent, and that the law, or at least the technicalities of it, would protect her from consequences. I trusted her because she was my mother, because she had framed her involvement as protection rather than control, and because I wanted to believe that family love was stronger than entitlement. But that trust became the very mechanism she used to strip my daughter of her financial safety net in a single morning. As I replayed those early conversations in my mind after discovering the withdrawal, I realized how carefully she had positioned herself, how she had used my youth and exhaustion to secure a level of access she would later exploit, and how my gratitude had blinded me to the imbalance of power embedded in that arrangement. I had thought I was building something solid and safe for Lily, but the foundation included a flaw I did not recognize until it collapsed, and that flaw was the assumption that shared blood guaranteed shared values. Greetings alone later that day, staring at the bank statement, I understood with painful clarity that my mother had not broken the rules, she had used them. And that distinction would matter enormously in the fight ahead. Because reclaiming my daughter's future would not be as simple as pointing out that something was wrong. I would have to prove that what was legal was not the same as what was just, and that the trust I had given so freely had been deliberately and strategically abused. What made the betrayal harder to process was not just the money itself, but the realization that my mother's decision fit perfectly into a pattern I had spent most of my life refusing to name. A pattern where sacrifice was expected from me and protection was reserved for someone else. And once I allowed myself to see it clearly, I could trace it all the way back to childhood. I am the older sister by 3 years, born first, expected to be responsible early, praised for being mature, while my younger sister Rachel, now 33, was always described as sensitive, creative, someone who needed more support. And those labels followed us into adulthood in ways that shaped every family interaction. When Rachel struggled financially, it was never framed as a failure or a consequence of her choices. It was always a temporary setback that required immediate intervention. My mother paying off credit cards, covering rent, co-signing loans, telling herself and anyone who would listen that Rachel just needed a little boost, that life had been harder on her, that it would all even out someday. When I struggled, the response was very different. My mother would nod thoughtfully and say, "Emma is strong. She will figure it out." And I did, every time, because I had to. And because doing so earned me approval that felt conditional, but still mattered to me more than I wanted to admit. This imbalance became normalized over the years, so subtle that it was easy to dismiss. Rachel received help. I received praise. And both were framed as appropriate responses to who we were. But what that really meant was that Rachel learned she could rely on rescue, while I learned I could rely only on myself. My father, Daniel, played his part too. Not by overt favoritism, but by silence, by the constant avoidance of confrontation, by the way he would change the subject or leave the room whenever my mother made unilateral decisions. And growing up, I mistook that silence for neutrality, when in reality, it was enabling behavior that allowed my mother's worldview to dominate the family without challenge. Holidays, birthdays, even casual dinners followed the same script. Rachel's needs discussed at length, her plans prioritized, her problems framed as collective concerns, while my life was treated as stable background noise, something assumed to be under control because I did not complain. When Lily was born, that dynamic intensified rather than softened, because my mother saw my daughter not as an independent person with her own future, but as an extension of me, and by extension, as another resource that could be managed according to her priorities. She loved Lily in her own way, of that I have no doubt, but it was a love filtered through control, through the belief that she knew best, that her judgment outweighed mine, and that family hierarchy gave her the authority to override my decisions whenever she deemed it necessary. Over the years, she made comments that seemed harmless at the time, but now feel loaded with implication. Remarks about how much money I was putting away when Rachel was struggling. Jokes about how Lily was lucky to have such a driven mother, while Rachel was still finding her path. And each time I laughed it off, unwilling to create tension by pointing out the obvious disparity. What I did not fully understand was that my silence was not just self-preservation. It was participation in a system that rewarded entitlement and punished independence. And my mother had learned that as long as I kept absorbing the imbalance quietly, she could continue redistributing resources from me to Rachel without ever saying it out loud. The day I confronted her about the missing money, that pattern snapped into focus with brutal clarity, because her justification was not framed as a mistake or an emergency. It was framed as inevitability, as if my role in the family naturally included giving up my child's future so my sister's present could be secured. She spoke as if this had always been the understanding, as if the years of praise I received for being responsible were simply the down payment on moments like this, moments where she could cash in my reliability for someone else's benefit. My father's reaction only reinforced that realization, because when he cried and apologized, it was clear that he was not shocked by the idea that my mother would prioritize Rachel. He was shocked that she had gone so far, that she had acted so decisively and so openly. And even then, his instinct was remorse rather than resistance, guilt rather than action. In that moment, I saw my family not as a collection of individuals, but as a structure, one that depended on my compliance to function smoothly, one where my sacrifices were invisible until they stopped, and my mother's authority went unquestioned until it produced consequences too large to ignore. Rachel's role in all of this became impossible to separate from the larger pattern, because whether or not she had explicitly asked for the money, she benefited from a lifetime of favoritism that taught her she could accept help without asking where it came from. And that assumption was something my mother actively cultivated. When I later thought about the timing of the withdrawal, how it coincided perfectly with Rachel's major life expenses, it became clear that this was not a spontaneous decision made in isolation. It was the culmination of years of implicit permission, years of my mother positioning me as the dependable source, and Rachel as the deserving recipient. I realized then that my anger was not just about one transaction. It was about the cumulative weight of being cast as the family's emotional and financial shock absorber, the one who could always be leaned on, because I had proven I would not break. That role had cost me more than money over the years. It had cost me the ability to set boundaries without guilt, the freedom to prioritize my own child without being labeled selfish, and the illusion that fairness would eventually emerge on its own if I just kept being patient. Sitting with that understanding was painful, but it was also clarifying, because it stripped away any lingering hope that this situation could be resolved through a simple conversation or an apology. This was not about miscommunication. It was about a deeply entrenched belief system where my needs and my child's future were negotiable, and my mother's authority was not. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what that meant. That if I backed down now, if I accepted this theft quietly for the sake of family peace, I would be teaching my daughter the same lesson I had been taught, that her sacrifices would always be expected, and her boundaries would always be secondary. And that realization hardened something inside me, because I knew with absolute certainty that I would not pass that legacy on to Lily, no matter how much conflict it created, no matter how many relationships it disrupted, because protecting my child meant breaking a pattern that had been normalized for generations. And I was finally ready to do that, even if it meant standing alone. The shift from shock to understanding did not happen all at once. It arrived in fragments over the next few days, as my nervous system settled enough for my mind to begin connecting dots I had ignored for years. And each connection tightened the knot in my chest, because it pointed to the same conclusion. This was not an impulsive act driven by panic or confusion. This was a plan that had been forming quietly, patiently, behind a mask of concern and family loyalty. The first clue came when I pulled the statements from the past year and laid them out on my kitchen table, the same table where I had balanced budgets and helped Lily with homework, because patterns reveal themselves when you stop looking at events in isolation. And once I did that, the timing stopped looking random. The withdrawal did not occur during a crisis or a medical emergency. It happened weeks before Lily was scheduled to submit her final college applications, and days after my sister Rachel announced, with a breathless excitement that filled the family group chat, that she and her partner were finally ready to make a big move, a house, a wedding, a fresh start that everyone applauded without asking how it would be paid for. I remembered my mother's casual comments in the months leading up to it, remarks about money sitting idle, about how opportunities should be seized when they present themselves, about how family has to support each other in real time rather than hoarding resources for the future. And I felt a chill as I recognized those statements not as opinions, but as groundwork. I searched my email next, not because I expected to find something incriminating, but because I needed to understand how my mother had been thinking about the account. And buried in routine correspondence were phrases that made my stomach drop. References to Lily's fund as a cushion, as backup, as money that could be shifted if necessary. Language that reframed a child's education as a flexible asset rather than a protected purpose. The more I read, the clearer it became that my mother had never truly accepted the idea that the money belonged to Lily. She had tolerated that framing as long as it did not conflict with her priorities, and the moment it did, she felt justified in overriding it. I replayed our conversation in my mind, the way she laughed when I confronted her, the ease with which she dismissed my objections, And I understood that confidence does not come from improvisation. It comes from certainty, from having already decided how you will explain yourself when challenged. She had rehearsed this, maybe not out loud, but internally, telling herself that I would calm down, that Lily would adapt, that Rachel's needs were immediate and therefore more real, and that if there were consequences, they would be manageable, because they always had been. My father's admission added another layer to that realization, because his confusion was not about whether the money was Lily's. He knew it was. His confusion was about how far my mother had gone, which meant the idea of using my resources for family purposes was not new, only the scale was. And that distinction mattered, because it revealed that the moral line my mother crossed had been inching forward for years with no resistance. I began to think back over moments that had felt off at the time, but easy to dismiss. The way my mother had asked detailed questions about the account structure, about access, about what would happen if Lily chose a less expensive school. The way she had reassured me that having her name on the account gave her the ability to handle things efficiently if needed. Efficiency being her favorite word when she wanted to justify control. None of those moments felt alarming on their own, but together they formed a trajectory, a steady movement toward a conclusion she had already reached, that the money was ultimately hers to allocate. What unsettled me most was the realization that my mother did not see herself as stealing. She saw herself as redistributing, as correcting an imbalance she believed she had the authority to define. And that belief was rooted in a lifetime of being the family's decision-maker, the one whose judgment went unchallenged because questioning it created discomfort everyone preferred to avoid. I recognized my own role in that system with painful clarity, because every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace, every time I accepted praise instead of support, I reinforced the idea that my needs and boundaries were negotiable, and my mother internalized that lesson so deeply that she felt comfortable making a unilateral decision that would alter my daughter's life trajectory without consulting me. The thought that this plan might have been discussed with Rachel, even indirectly, made my stomach churn. Not because I wanted to vilify my sister, but because it meant the pattern extended beyond one relationship. It meant the family narrative had been shaped to normalize taking from me, framing it as help, as sharing, as something I owed by virtue of being capable. When I finally allowed myself to name the act for what it was, not a misunderstanding, not poor judgment, but premeditated exploitation, something in me hardened, because that label carried implications I could not ignore. Premeditation meant intent. It meant awareness. It meant my mother understood the impact of her actions and chose them anyway. And once that truth settled in, the idea of resolving this quietly for the sake of family harmony became impossible. I looked at Lily that evening as she sat at the kitchen counter, excitedly talking about a program she had discovered online, her voice bright with possibility. And I felt a surge of protectiveness so strong it bordered on rage. Because my mother had gambled with that lightness, had treated it as collateral in a family transaction that served her vision rather than my child's reality. That was the moment I stopped framing this as a painful family conflict and started framing it as a violation that demanded accountability. Because intentions matter, and the intention behind my mother's actions was not care, it was control. I understood then that the path forward would not be easy or clean, that it would involve scrutiny, confrontation, and consequences that would ripple through every relationship I had grown up with. But I also understood that doing nothing would be its own kind of decision, one that would teach my daughter that her future was expendable in the face of someone else's desires. Naming the act as premeditated did not bring me comfort, but it brought me clarity, and clarity is dangerous to systems built on silence, because once you see how the pieces fit together, you cannot unsee them, and you cannot pretend that patience will eventually transform injustice into fairness. As I gathered my notes, my statements, my emails, and my resolve, I accepted a truth that frightened me, but also steadied my hands. This was no longer about reclaiming money. It was about interrupting a pattern of entitlement that had reached into the next generation, and I was prepared to do whatever it took to stop it. Because my mother had made a calculated choice, and now I was going to respond with equal deliberation, not as a wounded daughter hoping for understanding, but as a mother determined to protect her child, even if that meant exposing truths my family had spent decades avoiding. If the realization that my mother's actions were premeditated hardened my resolve, the next step was learning how not to face it alone. Because clarity without support can collapse into despair. And I was dangerously close to that edge when Michael Reed walked into my kitchen that evening, set his keys down, and immediately knew something was wrong. Michael was 41, steady in a way that came from experience rather than detachment. And unlike most people in my life, he did not rush to minimize or reframe pain to make it more comfortable to sit with. I told him everything, not in a dramatic rush, but methodically, laying out the facts the way I had begun to see them myself: the zero balance, the in-person withdrawal, my mother's laugh, my father's apology, the patterns that finally made sense. And as I spoke, I watched his face change, not into anger, but into focus. When I finished, there was a long pause, and then he said something that shifted the ground beneath my feet. "Emma, this is not family drama. This is financial abuse." And the way he said it, calmly, without hesitation, stripped away the last layer of confusion I had been clinging to. I had spent years normalizing behavior that made me uncomfortable because it came wrapped in family language. But hearing it named so plainly forced me to confront the reality that what had happened crossed boundaries recognized far beyond our household. Michael did not ask me what I wanted to do in an emotional sense. He asked practical questions about the account structure, about documentation, about timelines, because he understood something I was only beginning to accept: that intention and evidence mattered, and that protecting Lily would require more than moral outrage. He reminded me that strength did not mean handling everything alone, that resilience did not require silence, and that asking for help now was not a failure of character, but an act of responsibility. That conversation marked a turning point, because for the first time, I stopped framing my hesitation as loyalty and started recognizing it as fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being labeled ungrateful, fear of disrupting the fragile peace my family maintained by never challenging my mother directly. Michael challenged that fear gently but firmly, asking me what message I wanted Lily to absorb from this moment, whether she would learn that boundaries matter even when they are uncomfortable, or that love requires enduring harm quietly. That question followed me into the next day, echoing in my mind as I went through the motions of work, caring for patients, coordinating staff, functioning competently on the surface, while something fundamental reorganized itself inside me. I began to see my role differently, not as the dutiful daughter navigating a difficult parent, but as the primary guardian of my child's future, a role that carried obligations that superseded family hierarchy. That shift was subtle but profound, because it reframed every choice in front of me, turning what had felt like an impossible conflict into a clear priority. When my father called again, his voice tentative, asking if we could talk things through calmly, I noticed how my body responded differently. Less urgency to appease, more awareness of my own limits. And when I told him that calm conversation would not undo what had been done, that accountability was necessary, he fell silent in a way that suggested he had never considered that possibility. My mother did not call, and that absence spoke volumes, because she was accustomed to being the one who dictated the terms of reconciliation, and my refusal to engage on her schedule disrupted her expectations. As the days passed, I started organizing my thoughts the way I organized everything else in my life: lists, folders, timelines, because structure gave me a sense of control that emotion alone could not. Michael helped me sort through bank statements, highlighting deposits, noting dates, identifying patterns, and each line item felt like a tangible representation of time I had given up, of choices I had made deliberately, and that reinforced my determination not to let those sacrifices be dismissed as excess or convenience. At night, after Lily went to bed, I lay awake thinking about the generational implications of what I was doing, because standing up to my mother meant challenging the family narrative that had shaped me, the story that cast her as the ultimate authority and me as the capable subordinate. And I knew that dismantling that narrative would not be met with universal approval. There were moments when doubt crept in, when I wondered if pursuing consequences would fracture relationships beyond repair, when I imagined the judgment of relatives who would hear a simplified version of events and conclude that I had chosen money over family. And in those moments, I had to remind myself that the money was not the point. The future it represented was. Michael's presence during that time was not dramatic or heroic. It was consistent. The way he showed up with dinner when I forgot to eat, the way he listened without trying to fix my feelings, the way he insisted that preparation was not aggression, and that boundaries were not acts of cruelty. Through him, I began to understand that my hesitation was rooted in a lifetime of being rewarded for endurance rather than assertiveness, and that breaking that habit would feel unnatural at first, like using a muscle that had been deliberately underdeveloped. The more I leaned into that discomfort, the more I recognized how much of my identity had been shaped around being the reliable one, the one who absorbed stress to keep others comfortable, and how unsustainable that role had become now that it threatened my child. One evening, as Lily sat across from me at the table, absorbed in her laptop, talking excitedly about a scholarship opportunity she had found, I felt a surge of clarity that cut through every lingering doubt, because her optimism existed in direct contrast to the reality my mother had created, and protecting that optimism became non-negotiable. I realized then that the transition I was undergoing was not just about confronting a specific injustice. It was about redefining myself, moving from a position of reactive resilience to intentional defense, from accommodating dysfunction to challenging it. That evolution did not erase the pain of betrayal, but it gave it direction, channeling it into purposeful action rather than paralysis. By the end of that week, I no longer thought of myself as someone navigating a family crisis. I thought of myself as someone preparing for a necessary confrontation with systems of control that had long gone unchecked. That mental shift was both terrifying and empowering, because it meant I could no longer hide behind confusion or hope that things would resolve on their own. It meant acknowledging that the only way forward involved asserting truths that would unsettle people who benefited from my silence. As I organized my documents and prepared to take the next steps, I accepted that the version of myself who avoided conflict at all costs could not protect my daughter, and that stepping into this new role would require me to tolerate discomfort, judgment, and the possibility of permanent change in my family relationships. That acceptance did not come with relief, but it came with resolve, and for the first time since discovering the empty account, I felt something steadier than fear guiding me. The understanding that being a good mother sometimes means becoming someone your family does not recognize, someone who chooses justice over appeasement and accountability over illusion. And once that understanding took hold, there was no turning back. Walking into the bank that had held my daughter's future for nearly 2 decades felt surreal, like stepping onto a stage where the scenery looked familiar, but the script had changed completely. Because this was the same branch where I had deposited overtime paychecks, tax refunds, and small windfalls with quiet pride. And now, I was there to document how easily all of it had been taken. Michael came with me, not to speak for me, but to stand beside me, a steady presence that reminded me I did not have to navigate this alone. And as we waited in the polished lobby with its neutral colors and muted music, I noticed how calm my body felt compared to the days before. Not because I was unafraid, but because I had accepted that clarity required action. When the branch manager called us into his office, I introduced myself, stated my age and occupation, and explained the purpose of the account in plain terms, that it had been opened 18 years earlier as a college fund for my daughter Lily, now 18, that I had been the primary contributor, and that the entire balance of $214,000 had been withdrawn without my knowledge. He listened carefully, nodding, and then delivered the line I had expected but still dreaded, that joint accounts grant equal access to authorized users, and that from the bank's perspective, the transaction appeared legitimate. I did not argue with him, because I had learned that confrontation without preparation only reinforces resistance. Instead, I acknowledged his statement and asked for specifics. Who processed the withdrawal? What identification was presented? Whether it was done in person or electronically? And whether there were internal notes attached to the transaction. The shift in his demeanor was subtle but noticeable because detailed questions signal seriousness, and seriousness changes how institutions respond. He logged into his system, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, and as he reviewed the record, he confirmed that my mother, Margaret Brooks, had appeared in person, presented valid identification, signed the withdrawal form, and requested the full balance in a single transaction, and the amount, $214,000, appeared on the screen like a verdict. I asked him to print the documentation, including the timestamp, the teller identification, and any notes recorded during the interaction. And after a brief hesitation, he agreed, explaining that while the transaction itself could not be reversed unilaterally, I was entitled to a complete record of activity on an account bearing my name. As the printer hummed, I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger at how straightforward the theft had been, and relief that facts existed independent of family narratives, because paper does not care about hierarchy or guilt. It only reflects what happened. When he handed me the printed report, I saw a confirmation of something that mattered more than I had expected. The withdrawal had been completed at the same branch my mother frequented regularly, by a teller who knew her by name, which meant there was no confusion, no rushed misunderstanding, and no external pressure. She had walked in calmly and asked for the money, confident in her authority, and in the assumption that no one would question her intent. I asked whether the bank could provide a notarized statement summarizing the transaction and my role as the primary contributor. And after consulting briefly with their compliance department, the manager agreed to prepare one, cautioning that it would reflect factual details rather than legal conclusions. That distinction mattered because I was beginning to understand that reclaiming my daughter's future would not hinge on outrage, but on documentation that established intent, pattern, and impact. As we left the office, Michael squeezed my hand lightly, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement, because this was not justice yet. It was infrastructure, the groundwork upon which accountability could be built. Outside, sitting in the car, I reviewed the documents again, noticing details I had missed at first: the exact time of the withdrawal, the method of disbursement, and the absence of any notation indicating an emergency or special circumstance. And each detail chipped away at the narrative my mother would later attempt to construct. That afternoon, I organized everything into folders, statements by year, deposits highlighted, and the withdrawal marked clearly, because patterns become undeniable when they are laid out chronologically, and I needed to see the full arc, not just the ending. As I worked, I felt a shift in how I perceived the bank, no longer as a neutral holder of funds, but as a witness, an institution that could corroborate facts my family might deny. And that realization brought a measure of steadiness I had not felt since the account was emptied. I also felt the first crack appear in my mother's presumed invulnerability, because while she had relied on legal access to justify her actions, she had not accounted for scrutiny, for the way documentation could transform a private act into an examinable event. Later that evening, my father called again, his tone tentative, asking if I had been to the bank, and when I confirmed it, he sighed deeply, as if the reality of consequences was beginning to register. And he asked whether there was anything he could do to help. I told him the truth, that the most helpful thing he could do was to be honest if asked, to stop minimizing, and to acknowledge what he knew about the purpose of the account. And his silence in response told me that even this step would require him to confront choices he had spent a lifetime avoiding. As I filed the documents away, I realized that the bank visit had accomplished something essential beyond paperwork. It had shifted the power dynamic, because my mother's authority thrived in ambiguity, in family conversations without witnesses, and in assumptions that went unchallenged. And now there was a record that existed outside her control. I knew this was only the beginning, that institutions move slowly, and that resistance would intensify once legal language entered the picture. But for the first time since discovering the empty balance, I felt grounded in something tangible, evidence that did not rely on memory or emotion. That night, as I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of the house, I thought about how easily trust can be weaponized when it is embedded in systems that privilege access over intent, and how many people never realize that until it is too late. I also thought about Lily, about the way she assumed that the adults in her life were making responsible decisions on her behalf. And I understood that what I was doing now, gathering documents, asking precise questions, refusing to accept vague assurances, was as much about modeling a different approach to power as it was about reclaiming money. The bank had not given me justice, but it had given me clarity, and clarity has a way of destabilizing narratives built on entitlement, because once facts are fixed on paper, they cannot be laughed away, minimized, or reframed as misunderstandings. And I knew that when my mother finally realized how much of her story was documented, the ease with which she had dismissed my concerns would begin to falter. Because control depends on secrecy, and the bank, unintentionally, had just removed a crucial layer of it. The office where I met Thomas Hale did not look dramatic, which I later realized was part of why the conversation that unfolded there felt so devastatingly real. Because there were no oak panels or imposing portraits, just neutral walls, a heavy desk, and the quiet hum of a city outside the window. The kind of place where ordinary lives quietly collide with legal consequences. Thomas was 45, measured, precise, with the calm demeanor of someone who had spent years translating chaos into language courts could understand. And after brief introductions, he asked me to tell the story from the beginning, not emotionally, but chronologically. Who opened the account, when, why, who deposited funds, who withdrew them, and how those withdrawals were justified at the time. I had prepared myself to speak clearly, but as I laid out the facts, the joint account opened when I was 19, the explicit purpose of Lily's education, my role as the primary contributor for 18 years, the in-person withdrawal by my mother of the entire balance, and her response when confronted. I felt the weight of each detail settle into the room, because stripped of family context, the story sounded stark, almost clinical, and that contrast made it harder to hide behind sentiment. Thomas reviewed the documents I had brought, the bank statements, the notarized summary, the highlighted deposits, and he did not interrupt as he read, which stretched the silence into something heavy and anticipatory. When he finally looked up, he did not soften his words, and that honesty, though jarring, was what I needed. Because he said, legally, a joint account does grant access, but access does not erase intent, and intent is where this becomes serious. He explained that courts do not only consider whether a person could take money, but whether they did so in a way that violated an understood purpose, especially when that purpose involves a dependent child. And as he spoke, he pointed to specific patterns in the documentation: the consistent labeling of deposits as college savings, the absence of any withdrawals by my mother prior to this event, the timing of the withdrawal relative to Lily's application deadlines, and the immediate use of funds for purposes unrelated to my daughter. I asked him, almost whispering, whether this meant I could get the money back, and he did not answer immediately, because he was careful not to promise outcomes. But he did say something that landed with the force of a gavel. "Emma, this crosses into fraud." The word hung in the air between us, heavy and unmistakable. And for a moment, I felt disoriented, because fraud was not a word I associated with my mother, a woman who prided herself on her reputation, her involvement in church committees, her careful cultivation of respectability. And yet, when Thomas broke it down, the logic was unavoidable. Fraud, he explained, does not always involve forged signatures or fake identities. It can involve misrepresentation, using lawful access to obtain funds under false pretenses, especially when those funds are then diverted in a way that causes harm to a vulnerable party. And in this case, the vulnerable party was my daughter. He outlined the legal pathways calmly: a civil action seeking restitution and damages based on unjust enrichment and breach of fiduciary duty implied by the account's purpose, and the potential for criminal exposure if evidence showed my mother misrepresented the purpose of the withdrawal to bank staff or coordinated with others to conceal the source or use of the funds. Hearing it framed that way shifted my internal landscape again, because until then, a part of me had clung to the idea that this was a family dispute that happened to involve money. But Thomas was naming it as a violation that existed independent of our relationships, something the legal system recognized as wrong, regardless of who committed it. I asked him whether pursuing this would mean dragging my mother through court, whether there was any way to resolve it quietly. And he did not dismiss that concern, but he was clear about the trade-offs, explaining that quiet resolutions often depend on cooperation and accountability, and that so far, my mother had shown neither, laughing off my concerns and asserting her authority rather than acknowledging harm. He also emphasized something that cut through my lingering guilt: that allowing a parent to avoid consequences in a case like this does not preserve family. It reinforces a belief that boundaries do not apply within it, and that belief, once internalized, tends to escalate rather than diminish. We talked about Lily, about how courts view funds designated for education, about the moral weight attached to protecting a child's future, and about how judges respond to clear paper trails that show a pattern of sacrifice and intent. And as he spoke, I felt a strange mix of fear and validation: fear of what would happen once legal action began, and validation that my instincts had not been exaggerated or selfish. Thomas asked whether there were emails or messages where my mother referenced the account's purpose, and when I mentioned the language I had found describing the money as a cushion or something that could be shifted, his expression sharpened, because words matter in law, and those phrases suggested a mindset that could undermine any claim of innocent misunderstanding. He explained that in cases like this, the narrative often becomes as important as the numbers, because judges are human, and when presented with evidence that a grandmother knowingly diverted her granddaughter's education fund for other uses, especially after years of framing the money as protected, the moral implications influence how the law is applied. I asked him whether my father's knowledge, or lack thereof, would matter, and he said it could, particularly if it established that my mother acted unilaterally, reinforcing the idea that this was a deliberate decision rather than a shared family agreement. As the consultation continued, I felt the last of my internal resistance give way, because the conversation was no longer abstract. It was grounded in statutes, precedents, and procedural steps, and that grounding made denial impossible. When Thomas outlined the next steps, formal demand letters, potential subpoenas for bank and vendor records, the possibility of mediation followed by litigation if necessary. I realized that there was no version of this path that would be comfortable, but there were versions that would be effective, and effectiveness was now my priority. Before we ended, he looked at me directly and said something I will never forget. Protecting your child sometimes means letting the truth be seen by people who would rather keep it hidden, and the law exists for moments like this, when private power is abused in ways that harm the vulnerable. Walking out of his office, the city felt louder, sharper, as if the world had been turned up a notch, and I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, absorbing the implications of what I had just heard. The word fraud echoed in my mind, not as a weapon I wanted to wield, but as a reality I could no longer ignore, because it named the seriousness of what had been done in a way that stripped away excuses and sentimentality. I knew that once legal language entered my family's orbit, everything would change. Conversations would harden, alliances would shift, and narratives would be contested. But I also knew that retreating from that knowledge would mean accepting a version of events that minimized harm and preserved my mother's comfort at my daughter's expense. That afternoon, I told Michael what the lawyer had said, and he did not look surprised, only resolute, because he had seen the pattern before, and he reminded me that accountability is not an act of cruelty. It is a boundary enforced when trust has been violated. That night, as I watched Lily laugh at something on her phone, unaware of the legal terminology now attached to her future, I felt a fierce clarity settle in. Because whatever pain this process would bring, it was less than the pain of teaching her that exploitation can be laughed away if it comes from family. And in that clarity, the decision I had been circling for days finally crystallized. I would pursue this fully, not out of vengeance, but out of obligation, because the line my mother crossed was not a matter of opinion. It was a matter of law, and more importantly, of justice. The invitation arrived 2 weeks later in a thick cream envelope that pretended nothing had changed. A carefully worded announcement of a celebration at my sister Rachel's new house, a combined engagement and housewarming party that my mother had been talking up for months. The kind of event designed to display success, stability, and unity. And when I read it, I understood immediately why it mattered. Because it would gather everyone who benefited from my silence in one place. My mother, my sister, my father, extended family, friends who admired my mother's generosity without ever asking where it came from. And that made it the most honest stage left to me. I did not tell many people what I planned to do. Not because I wanted drama, but because preparation requires quiet, and the less time my mother had to spin her version of events, the better. So I focused on assembling what mattered, the documents Thomas had advised me to prepare. Bank statements, notarized summaries, timelines showing deposits and the single withdrawal, copies of emails that revealed intent, all organized into a folder that felt heavier than its paper weight, because it carried 18 years of discipline and a future my daughter deserved. Michael stood with me as I sorted and resorted everything the night before the event, reminding me that the goal was not humiliation, but clarity, not shouting, but facts. Because facts change rooms in ways anger cannot. And as I listened to his steady voice, I felt the nervous energy settle into something focused. Lily knew we were going, and she knew why. Not every detail, but enough to understand that something important was happening. And when she asked if she needed to come, I told her yes, because this was about her future, and hiding her from it would send the wrong message. And she nodded with a seriousness that made my throat tighten, because at 18, she was learning what it meant to watch adults be accountable in real time. The house was already full when we arrived, laughter spilling out into the driveway, music playing softly, the air thick with the easy confidence of people who believed the story they had been told. And as we stepped inside, conversations paused just enough for me to feel the shift. The awareness that I was there when I was not expected to bring anything but congratulations. My mother spotted us almost immediately, her smile tightening for a fraction of a second before smoothing back into place. And she moved toward me with practiced warmth, reaching out as if to hug me, a gesture that felt surreal given the silence since our confrontation. And I stepped back gently, not making a scene, just creating space, because space was the point. She lowered her voice and said we would talk later, not now, as if she still believed she could control the timing. And I replied calmly that later had already passed, that now was appropriate. And the flicker of irritation that crossed her face told me she had not expected resistance delivered so quietly. Rachel approached then, flushed with excitement and nerves, thanking everyone for coming, her eyes skimming past me before settling with uncertainty. And when she asked if everything was okay, my mother answered for me, saying we would discuss it privately. And that assumption, that my voice could be deferred indefinitely, hardened my resolve. When my father joined us, his posture was tense, his eyes tired, and I saw in him the cost of years spent avoiding moments like this. And when he whispered that this was not the place, I told him gently that it was exactly the place. Because decisions made in public deserve public truth. The opportunity arrived sooner than I expected, because Rachel's partner tapped a glass to gather attention, thanking my mother for her generosity, praising her for making so much possible. And as the room applauded, I felt the pivot point approach, that instant where silence would confirm the narrative or challenge it. And I knew which path I had chosen. I stepped forward, not rushing, not interrupting, waiting for the applause to fade before speaking in a clear, steady voice that carried across the room, saying that before the celebration continued, there was something important everyone needed to know about how it had been funded. The effect was immediate and visceral. Conversations stopped, faces turned, and my mother's smile froze, her eyes sharpening as she realized control had slipped. And she said my name with a warning edge, telling me not to do this, not here. But the room was already listening, and once attention shifts, it cannot be commanded back. I introduced myself simply, stating my age, my role as Lily's mother, and the purpose of the account I had opened 18 years earlier, explaining that it was a college fund built through consistent contributions for my daughter's education. And I held up the first document, a bank statement enlarged for clarity, showing the balance before the withdrawal, $214,000, and then the transaction that reduced it to zero in a single day. There was a murmur then, confusion rippling outward, and my mother attempted to interject, calling it a misunderstanding, a family arrangement. But I continued, not raising my voice, just moving through the facts the way Thomas had advised, because interruptions only work when they are allowed. I stated plainly that the withdrawal had been made in person by my mother, that it had not been authorized by me, and that when I confronted her, she had laughed and described the money as something important she had chosen to use elsewhere. And the room reacted to that detail, because laughter carries a moral weight that explanations do not. I held up another document, the notarized summary from the bank, and then copies of emails where the account was referenced as flexible, as something that could be shifted, and I read a line aloud, not dramatically, just clearly, letting the words speak for themselves, and I watched as people processed the implication that a child's education fund had been treated as a convenience. Rachel's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something like nausea, and she asked quietly if it was true, if the money had come from Lily's fund. And my mother attempted to reassure her, insisting it was family money, that it would be sorted out. But the lack of denial mattered more than anything she said. When my father spoke, his voice shaking, confirming that the account had always been understood to be for Lily's education, the room changed in a way I could feel physically, like a pressure drop, because ambiguity had been replaced with confirmation. I said then what I had rehearsed, but never fully believed I would say aloud. That my lawyer had reviewed the documentation and described the act as fraud, not because of forged signatures, but because of misrepresentation and intent. Because the money had been taken under false pretenses and diverted away from its stated purpose, causing direct harm to a dependent child. That word, fraud, landed hard, and I watched faces tighten as people recalibrated their understanding. Because fraud is not a family disagreement, it is a violation that carries consequences. My mother's composure cracked then, her voice rising as she accused me of exaggeration, of airing private matters, of choosing money over family. And I let her speak, because anger often reveals what denial hides. And when she said that Lily could take loans, that education was a privilege, not a right, I saw several people flinch, because those statements reframed her generosity as entitlement in a way no document ever could. Lily stood beside Michael near the back, her face pale but steady, and when she said softly that she had worked for scholarships and planned carefully because she believed the fund was protected, the room went quiet in a different way, because hearing the impact from the child herself stripped the argument of abstraction. I did not accuse Rachel directly, because this was not about assigning blame beyond where it belonged. But when she asked my mother why she had been told not to invite me, why she had been shielded from this information, my mother had no answer that did not reveal intent, and silence filled the gap. I concluded by stating what would happen next, not as a threat, but as a fact, that I would pursue restitution through legal channels, that I would not allow the matter to be minimized or reframed as a misunderstanding, and that my priority was restoring my daughter's future and establishing boundaries that had long been ignored. I thanked the room for listening, returned the documents to my folder, and stepped back, my heart pounding, but my voice steady, because the truth had been placed where it belonged, in the open. The aftermath was immediate and chaotic. Whispers, raised voices, people pulling others aside. Rachel crying quietly as her partner asked questions no one could answer quickly. My father standing frozen as if the ground had shifted beneath him, and my mother oscillating between fury and disbelief, as if she could not comprehend that her authority had been challenged publicly and supported by evidence. Michael guided Lily and me toward the door, and as we stepped outside into the evening air, the sounds from inside muffled behind us, I felt an unexpected lightness. Not relief exactly, but the absence of the burden I had carried alone for so long. Lily squeezed my hand and asked if I was okay, and I told her the truth, that I was scared and exhausted and certain all at once, because sometimes doing the right thing feels like that, a convergence of fear and resolve that leaves no room for doubt. Behind us, the celebration continued in a fractured way. Music restarting awkwardly, conversations resuming with a different tone. But the illusion had been broken, and once broken, it could not be restored, because people had seen the pattern, heard the words, and understood the cost. As we drove away, I knew the consequences would unfold over time, that my mother would attempt to reclaim the narrative, that family lines would be drawn, that reconciliation would be conditional at best. But I also knew something irreversible had happened. The room had turned, and with it, the power dynamic that had allowed my mother to act without accountability, and for the first time since discovering the empty account, I felt that the future was no longer being decided in rooms where my voice did not matter. What happened after that night did not arrive as one clean consequence, but as a series of fractures spreading outward from the moment the truth was spoken. Because systems built on silence do not fall quietly, they unravel in stages, and every stage exposes something that had been carefully hidden. Within hours of leaving Rachel's house, my phone began to vibrate with messages, some cautious, some confused, some openly accusatory, relatives asking what had happened, friends of my mother expressing shock, and others, quieter, sending brief notes that simply said they were sorry, or that they believed me. And the contrast between those reactions made the fault lines in my family unmistakably clear. My mother called that night and left a voicemail that swung between rage and wounded pride, accusing me of humiliating her, of poisoning the family against her, of choosing drama over discretion. And as I listened, I noticed something that would have escaped me before. She never denied taking the money. She never apologized for the harm to Lily. She focused entirely on the damage to her image. And that told me everything I needed to know about where her priorities still lay. My father did not call that night, but he came to my house the next morning, standing on the porch longer than necessary before knocking. His shoulders slumped in a way I had never seen before. And when I let him in, he did not sit down immediately. He paced, running a hand through his hair, repeating that he did not know how things had gone so far, that he never imagined my mother would do something like this. And I listened, because I needed to understand whether his shock was real or simply delayed. Eventually, he admitted that he had known about the account's purpose all along, that it had always been understood to be Lily's college fund, and that when my mother began talking about reallocating money, he had assumed she meant something temporary, something that would be repaid quietly. And that assumption, born of years of avoiding conflict, now sat between us like an indictment. I told him calmly that avoidance was not neutrality, that silence had consequences, and that by not questioning her plans, he had enabled a decision that harmed his granddaughter. And for the first time, he did not deflect or defend himself. He nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes, because the truth had finally become unavoidable. Rachel's reaction unfolded more publicly, because once people began asking questions, she was forced to confront information she had been shielded from, and the story she had been told, that the funds were family savings my mother had built up over time, collapsed under scrutiny. She called me 2 days later, her voice tight, asking if it was true that the money had come from Lily's fund, and when I confirmed it, she went quiet for a long time before saying she felt sick, that she would never have accepted help if she had known the source. And while I believed her confusion was genuine, it did not erase the reality that she had benefited from a system that prioritized her needs without demanding accountability. My mother's response to Rachel's distress was revealing, because instead of acknowledging wrongdoing, she accused Rachel of being ungrateful, of turning against her after everything she had done. And that exchange marked the beginning of a rupture between them, because Rachel was no longer a passive recipient. She was now confronted with the cost of her mother's control. Extended family members began to choose sides, some repeating my mother's narrative that family matters should remain private and that I had overreacted, others questioning how anyone could justify taking money designated for a child's education. And I learned quickly that people reveal their values most clearly when asked to decide what they are willing to excuse. The social consequences for my mother were subtle but significant. Invitations became less frequent, conversations more guarded, and the admiration she had cultivated through acts of generosity now carried an undercurrent of suspicion, because generosity loses its shine when its source is revealed. Professionally, she felt the impact as well, because several community roles she valued depended on trust and reputation, and while no one confronted her directly, the change in tone was unmistakable, a cooling that followed her into rooms where she had once been unquestioned. At home, the shift was even more pronounced, because my father, forced to reckon with his role, began asserting himself in small but meaningful ways, questioning decisions, asking where money was coming from, refusing to smooth things over. And those changes, though late, destabilized the dynamic my mother relied on, creating tension she could not control through authority alone. For me, the days following the confrontation were a study in emotional whiplash, moments of doubt followed by moments of fierce certainty. Because dismantling a long-standing family hierarchy does not bring immediate peace. It brings turbulence. And I had to remind myself repeatedly why I had chosen this path, returning to the image of Lily's future as my anchor. Lily herself processed the aftermath with a maturity that both comforted and pained me, because she understood more than I wished she had to. And when she told me she was proud of me for speaking up, I felt a surge of resolve that quieted every lingering second guess. My mother attempted to regain control through indirect means, sending messages through relatives, framing herself as a victim of betrayal, insisting that she had always intended to fix things, and when those efforts failed to produce the response she expected, her tone hardened, shifting from injured to accusatory, a transition that only reinforced the portrait that had emerged publicly. The family, once oriented around her authority, began to reorganize, conversations happening without her, decisions made independently. And while that fragmentation was painful to witness, it was also the necessary consequence of truth, because systems built on one person's unchecked power cannot survive transparency. I noticed my own internal changes as well, the absence of the familiar pressure to appease, the strange relief of not managing everyone else's emotions, and the clarity that came from aligning my actions with my values, even when the outcome was messy. By the end of that week, it was clear that my mother's influence, once absolute within our family, had been fundamentally weakened. Not because I had attacked her, but because the narrative that sustained her authority had been contradicted by evidence and lived experience. And authority without credibility cannot be maintained indefinitely. The collapse was not dramatic in a cinematic sense. There were no arrests or public denunciations, yet, but it was real and irreversible, visible in the way people spoke more cautiously around her, in the way my father no longer deferred automatically, in the way Rachel began questioning assumptions she had never examined before. As painful as it was to witness the family dividing, I understood that this division was not created by my actions. It was revealed by them. And that distinction mattered, because it meant the cost of silence had always been there, only hidden. Standing in my kitchen one evening, watching Lily work on an essay at the table where I had once balanced budgets, I felt a quiet sense of resolve, because whatever came next, legal battles, negotiations, or further estrangement, the illusion of unquestioned authority had been shattered, and in its place was something far more honest, a family forced to confront the reality of its own dynamics, and a mother who could no longer act as if her choices existed beyond scrutiny or consequence. Once the emotional shockwave settled, the process moved into a phase that was quieter but far more consequential, because feelings do not determine outcomes in courtrooms. Evidence does. And Thomas Hale wasted no time turning what I had gathered into formal action. The first step was a demand letter, precise and unambiguous, outlining the facts of the case, the documented purpose of the account, the timeline of deposits and the single withdrawal, and the legal theories supporting restitution, unjust enrichment, and misrepresentation. And when my mother received it, the tone of her communication changed immediately. Gone was the confident laughter, replaced by clipped messages insisting that lawyers were unnecessary, that families should not threaten each other, and that she was willing to discuss repayment informally if I would stop escalating things. Language that revealed a sudden awareness of risk without any acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Thomas advised me not to engage directly, explaining that informal promises are often used to delay and dilute accountability, and that consistency was critical now, because the strength of our position lay in the clarity of our documentation and the seriousness with which we pursued it. As weeks passed, subpoenas were issued to the bank and to vendors associated with Rachel's house and event expenses, and the paper trail that emerged was even clearer than I had anticipated, showing transfers that lined up precisely with the withdrawal, invoices paid shortly afterward, and communications that confirmed my mother had presented the funds as her own, while obscuring their true origin. When Thomas reviewed these records with me, His assessment was blunt. The pattern demonstrated intent, not confusion, and intent changes how judges view credibility. Mediation was scheduled as a required preliminary step, and walking into that room felt different from every family conversation I had ever endured. Because this space did not reward authority or volume. It rewarded facts, and my mother's discomfort was palpable from the moment she sat down. She arrived impeccably dressed, as if presentation could substitute for substance, and opened with a statement about misunderstandings and hurt feelings, framing herself as a parent who had only ever tried to help her children. But Thomas countered by methodically laying out the evidence, one piece at a time, deposits labeled for Lily's education, years of consistency, the sudden full withdrawal, and the immediate diversion of funds. And the mediator's questions grew more pointed as the narrative of confusion collapsed under scrutiny. When my mother offered a partial repayment plan framed as a gesture of goodwill, Thomas declined on my behalf, explaining that partial restitution did not address the harm done, particularly the lost time, stress, and disruption to Lily's educational planning, and that any resolution would need to reflect the seriousness of the violation. The turning point came when the mediator asked my mother directly whether she understood the account had been intended for Lily's education, and after a long pause, she said yes. And that admission, recorded and witnessed, stripped away the last layer of plausible deniability. Faced with the likelihood of a judge who would see the same evidence without patience for family rhetoric, my mother's legal counsel shifted strategies, focusing on damage control rather than defense, and negotiations became less combative and more pragmatic. The settlement that emerged was not gentle, because it could not be. It required my mother to liquidate certain assets, take out a loan, and commit to a structured repayment plan that restored the full $214,000 plus interest and a portion of legal fees, all to be deposited into a new account under my sole control, with Lily named as the irrevocable beneficiary. The terms also included restrictions preventing my mother from accessing or influencing the account in any way, closing the loophole that had enabled the theft in the first place. Signing those papers was surreal, because there was no sense of victory, only a sober acknowledgement that actions carry costs, and that cost, in this case, was the dismantling of a financial facade my mother had relied on for years. The consequences extended beyond money, because once the settlement became known within the family, the narrative my mother had tried to maintain lost credibility entirely, and the quiet distancing that had begun earlier solidified into something more permanent. My father moved out temporarily, needing space to confront the reality of his marriage without the buffer of denial. And Rachel, forced to reckon with the source of the help she had received, began taking tangible steps toward independence, returning funds she could, and restructuring her finances in ways she had never been required to before. For Lily, the impact was profound in a different way, because watching adults be held accountable reshaped her understanding of fairness and agency. And when I showed her the new account statement for the first time, the balance slowly rebuilding, she did not celebrate loudly. She simply nodded, as if absorbing a lesson that went far beyond numbers. The legal process was exhausting, emotionally and practically, but it achieved something essential. It translated moral outrage into enforceable boundaries, and that translation mattered, because without it, the message would have remained symbolic rather than protective. As the final payments were scheduled and the case closed, Thomas reminded me that justice is rarely dramatic. It is procedural, incremental, and often uncomfortable. But its power lies in its permanence. Because once boundaries are codified, they cannot be laughed away. My mother attempted one last appeal to emotion, suggesting that the settlement had taught its lesson and that it was time to move forward without resentment. But by then, I understood that forgiveness without accountability is simply permission to repeat harm, and I declined to engage beyond what was necessary. The price she paid was not just financial, it was the loss of unquestioned authority, the erosion of a reputation built on generosity without transparency, and the restructuring of relationships that could no longer rely on imbalance. Standing in the quiet after it was over, I felt a mixture of fatigue and resolve, because while the legal chapter had closed, the work of redefining my family dynamics had only begun. And that work would require the same discipline and clarity that had built Lily's fund in the first place. What the law had provided was not revenge, but restoration. And restoration, I learned, is often the most disruptive outcome of all, because it forces everyone involved to live with the reality where entitlement has limits, and where the future of a child is no longer a negotiable asset, but a protected right. When the legal process ended, there was no dramatic sense of closure, no moment where everything suddenly felt resolved, because justice does not erase history. It simply changes what happens next. And what happened next for me was quieter, slower, and far more personal than any courtroom outcome. The first time Lily and I visited her chosen campus after the settlement, the air felt different, not because the buildings were grand or the lawns perfectly kept, but because possibility had returned to a place where it had nearly been extinguished. And as she walked ahead of me, taking in the dorms, the lecture halls, the clusters of students laughing and arguing about things that felt enormous to them, I realized how close we had come to losing this moment. Not to chance or misfortune, but to entitlement disguised as love. Lily turned to me at one point, her eyes bright and unsure, and asked if it was really happening, if she was really allowed to plan for this now. And I told her yes, because permission had never been the issue, protection had. And this time, protection was real. Standing there, I felt the weight of the past 18 years settle into something steadier. Because every night shift, every skipped comfort, every choice to prioritize her future over my own ease had finally aligned with an outcome that honored those sacrifices instead of exploiting them. My relationship with my mother did not return to what it had been, and I no longer wanted it to, because returning would have required pretending that nothing fundamental had changed, and something had. I had. We moved into low contact. Brief messages on holidays, updates passed through my father, conversations stripped of intimacy and expectation. And while some people framed that distance as coldness, I experienced it as clarity. Because boundaries are not punishments. They are structures that make peace possible when trust has been broken. My father, changed by the consequences of his silence, began rebuilding his relationship with Lily on different terms. Showing up in ways he had not before, listening more than he spoke. And while I did not rewrite the past for him, I acknowledged the effort, because growth, even late, still matters. Rachel's path diverged in its own complicated way, her confrontation with the truth forcing her to reckon with how much of her life had been shaped by rescue rather than responsibility. And while we were not suddenly close, our interactions became more honest, stripped of the unspoken assumption that I would always absorb the cost of family harmony. For myself, the aftermath was a process of unlearning, of recognizing how deeply the role of the reliable one had been etched into my identity, and how often I had mistaken endurance for virtue. And therapy helped with that, not because it erased the pain, but because it gave me language for experiences I had normalized for too long. I learned that protecting your child sometimes means grieving the parent you wished you had, the family dynamic you hoped would eventually become fair, and that grief does not negate the necessity of action. It coexists with it. There were moments when doubt resurfaced, when I wondered if things could have been handled differently, more quietly, with less fallout. And in those moments, I returned to the image of Lily's future hanging in the balance, to the sound of my mother's laughter when confronted, and the doubt dissolved, because some lines, once crossed, redefine what responsibility requires. The rebuilt account grew steadily, interest accumulating, a visible reminder that restoration is possible even after profound violation. And each time I logged in and saw the balance increase, I felt not triumph, but relief, because the outcome matched the intention that had guided me for nearly 2 decades. Lily, now preparing for her first semester, carried herself differently, not hardened, but more aware. And when she told me she wanted to study environmental policy with an emphasis on ethics, I felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with values. She had watched adults be held accountable, watched truth disrupt comfort, and absorbed the lesson that fairness is not automatic, it is defended. And that lesson, more than any degree, felt like a legacy worth passing on. As for me, I no longer measure my worth by how much I can endure quietly, but by how well I protect what matters. And that shift has reshaped every area of my life, from work to relationships to the way I speak up when something feels wrong. I understand now that being a good daughter is not the same as being an obedient one, and being a good mother sometimes requires actions that will never be universally approved, because moral clarity rarely is. If there is one truth I carry forward from this experience, it is that family does not grant immunity from consequence, and love does not excuse exploitation, especially when the future of a child is at stake. I used to believe that forgiveness was the highest virtue, that letting things go was a sign of strength. But now I know that forgiveness without accountability teaches the wrong lesson, one that allows harm to repeat itself under the guise of peace. Looking back, I do not wish the conflict away, because it forced me to choose deliberately, to align my actions with my values rather than my fears. And in doing so, it changed the trajectory of my daughter's life and my own. As Lily packed for school, folding clothes on the same bed where she had once sprawled with college brochures and unguarded optimism, I felt a quiet certainty settle in, the kind that does not need validation, because it is rooted in action. And I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them knowing that her future was not negotiable, that it was worth defending, even when the threat came from within the family itself. If there is anyone listening to this who recognizes their own story in mine, who feels trapped between loyalty and responsibility, I want you to know that choosing your child is not betrayal. It is the clearest expression of love there is. And sometimes, teaching the next generation what boundaries look like is the most important inheritance we can offer. Because the future, once protected, has a way of honoring every sacrifice that built it.